I'd like to bring the Anacortes City Council meeting to order. And Ms. Hunt, would you take the attendance?
Mr. Carter, Mr. Young, Mr. Walters,
Here.
Ms. Cleland McGrath,
Here.
Ms. Moulton,
Here.
Mr. McDougall,
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Mayor Gear.
Yes.
Hey, I spoke with Anthony and I would like to excuse his absence if it's possible.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Cleland McGrath, a second by Mr. Miller. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right, at this time, then we'll move on to item 2 on the agenda, announcements and committee reports. We have 2 items tonight, item A and B. Item C, the planning committee was canceled, so there'll be no report. So for item A, I have our latest COVID update. And as of today, the City Hall reopened from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. and that's Monday through Friday. We will do that until July 6th when we reopen to our old hours from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. We're doing this soft opening to allow for staff to be fully vaccinated and take care of child issues and get us back up and running. As we reopen, our focus is on the safety of our staff and the public, and masks are not required for those who are fully vaccinated. And then in Skagit County, as of yesterday, June 13th, they reported a total of cases since March of 2020, 5,288 positive cases with 74 deaths and 349 people hospitalized. In the 98221 area code, since March of 20, a cumulative, we have had till present day, they estimate between 450 and 459 cases in our area code. The Skagit County Health Department has started doing pop-up vaccination clinics this summer. And you can go to their website and see where they're having them. They're doing them in different businesses, out up at Big Lake on the July 3rd at Skagit Speedway, that type of event. So you can look that up. This Tuesday, tomorrow, they'll be at Skagit Transit Station in downtown Mount Vernon from 8:30 to 10:30 a.m. And then on Wednesday, they'll be there in the evening from 5 to 9. They're also hosting a vaccination drive-in night with live music at the Skagit Fairgrounds from 5 to 8 p.m. this coming Saturday night. So lots of opportunity to get you and your family vaccinated if you haven't been able to do that. Locally here at Island Hospital, we've tested 17,266 residents, and we've had a total positive case from Island Hospital's tests of 352, and 65 people were admitted to our hospital during the last year and a half. In Washington State, we've had 446,000 cases of COVID. We've had 5,858 deaths. In the United States, we've had 34.3 million cases with 615,000 deaths. Also, vaccinations at Island Hospital have been administered, and so to date, they've administered 9,710 vaccines. And right now, 55% of Skagit County has been totally vaccinated with COVID vaccinations. In the state, there's been 141,656 people that have been totally vaccinated. And, no, that was in our county, excuse me. And then on our state, 7.4 million vaccinations have been administered in our state. So 141,000 vaccinations given in our county to date. And some of those, of course, you've got to have 2 of them. So, okay, so that's my report for tonight on COVID. Any questions? All right, so we'll move on now to 2B, which is our Finance Committee update.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. McDougall.
Finance Committee met last Wednesday afternoon, Mr. Walters, myself, And we were joined by actually a couple of guest speakers, Mr. Limberg and Ms. Shu from the Fiber Department. They wanted to basically get the Finance Committee to take a look at and review the item on this evening's agenda, the special market condition and the request for sole sourcing of MSTs, the multi-service terminals. These are basically part of the fiber installation where it's the breakout box that kind of hangs along the utility line, and they can break out, say, 8 different fibers out to different different residences or businesses. So there's basically a big shortage of those guys out on the market these days. And so the Fiber Department's bringing a special request this evening for kind of an expedited purchase of some of those guys. And it all looked good to us on the Finance Committee, made perfect sense. And Mr. Limberg will have more detail later this evening. And the second item we discussed was our emergency resolution for basically doing remote, city council meetings is again kind of expiring at the end of this month. And so we were discussing how to approach that if we want to extend it further. And there's another staff meeting happening later this week to discuss sort of logistics around that. Like, can we do sort of a hybrid, or how quickly can we pivot to hybrid meetings where we've got potentially city council members in City Hall with the mayor, and then potentially staff and community either in City Hall or also participating remotely. So ideally, we'd like to be able to offer a hybrid like that, but still working through some detail. Other pieces of the emergency resolution that need to be addressed, and we'll probably be looking at it, I would think, next week's city council meeting, is that emergency resolution also included the hiring freeze and a freeze on doing things like vehicle replacement, a freeze on certain expenses. So if we undo the emergency resolution, do we undo the entire thing? Do we undo pieces of it? That's kind of up for further discussion. And we also believe that the state could be ending its emergency declaration right around the end of the month as well. So that could have implications. So I think more discussion to come on that, and probably more next week at City Council.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
I guess just one correction there. I wasn't at that Finance Committee meeting. Maybe that was Mr. Carter. I was attending the groundbreaking of the Family Center's new building that we're funding with our affordable housing sales tax.
Oh, you're right. I conflated attendance with the fiber meeting, I think.
Yeah, there are a lot of them. And also the planning committee meeting, staff did cancel it for this afternoon, but we decided it was important to meet anyway, so we met at 4 p.m. And we just briefly discussed the critical areas ordinance that's before us tonight, and then also the really pressing need for childcare in Anacortes. And in concert with the HACS committee, we may have some suggestions in the very near future on what we can do with that.
Thank you. All right, so that was items 2B and 2C. Anything else? All right, so now we'll move on to item 3, which is public comment. And if anyone is attending tonight in the audience that would like to talk to the council about something that is not on the agenda, please raise your hand. It's your opportunity to do so. All right, I don't see any hands up. So we'll go back now to the agenda, and we're going to go into item 4, which is our consent agenda, items 4A through C.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
I move to approve a consent agenda items A through C. A second.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. McDougall. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. At this time, we'll go to other business. Item 5A. This is open for public comment. This is Friends of Skagit Beaches Citizen Science Outfall Monitoring Program. And I believe Diane Hettenberg will do the introductions this evening. Thank you, Diane. And
good evening, Mayor and Council and citizens. My name is Diane Hennebert. I'm the Stormwater Program Manager for the city. And with me tonight are Tim Gorky and Wayne Hughesby of the Friends of Skagit Beaches. And Wayne, I know you're on here if you want to throw up the screen share.
All right.
We're excited to share with you the Anacortes Stormwater Monitoring Project. And it has gotten up and running. You'll hear a little bit about that shortly. And as far as we can tell, and this is in consulting with Department of Ecology, we are the first place in Washington State to be doing this, a joint program between a municipality and a citizen group. So that's pretty exciting. Wayne, if you want to move on to the next slide, this picture can give you a visual of the scope of our project.
Uh-oh. I'm not moving. Why am I not moving? I seem to be stuck. Let me restart. I'm going to stop sharing and restart. Let's see if that...
So what you'll see in a moment is
Sorry about
an aerial photo of the city of Anacortes with our outfalls located on it. We have 79 outfalls from our storm system to the Salish Sea.
Oh boy. Isn't technology wonderful?
Sometimes.
I can get the screen up, but I can't seem to make it. Oh, that is. Any suggestions? I'm pretty good with this stuff. I've never had this problem before. I'm gonna exit all the way out and see if I can get it to. All right, now I'll get back into it. For some reason, it was just hung up. I'm not sure why. All right, let's try it again.
There we go.
All right, sorry about that. For some reason, decided to freeze, so I had to.
All right. So there's the city we all know and love with all of our outfalls, of which we have many. And next up, Tim will talk about how this program all got started.
Hello, Mayor. Hello, Council. My name is Tim, and I'm the fellow that had the idea to start with to create this partnership between the city and a volunteer group. The idea really came from a bit of information from the Department of Ecology's website, which they just make the statement and have proven it, that the stormwater is the biggest source of water pollution in all of Puget Sound in our area. And that caused me to wonder what the pollution level was in the Anacortes stormwater. So that right there is the kind of the key question. Wayne, could you go forward one?
I sure can.
Terrific.
It worked.
Very good. Thank you. This program, basically, it had really three things to even make it work. The first one was that without the participation of the city, and in particular Diane, we couldn't have made this work because she really is the expert in the subject matter. And so I sought her advice on the equipment, the process, and the project. The other thing is that this thing would require a fairly large number of volunteers to make work in our original concept. And also, we would wind up building a database of what all of our pollution measurements are for a 2-year period of time. And so that's no small body of work. Wayne, if you could go forward again. So what we wound up doing was we surveyed all of our outfalls and to pick out the ones that would be safe to get to for the volunteers. So if we had 79, we basically were able to pick out 60% of them that the volunteers could safely get to. Our next step is that we secured $20,000 for the testing equipment and lab equipment and the data entry costs that we would face for the 2-year period of time. And then we recruited 18 volunteers from the community. And at this point in time, we're 50% of the way through our 2-year grant period in evaluating the stormwater quality or the pollution level in the stormwater that we have in our city. Wayne, could you go to the next one? Kind of a surprise in this to me was the volunteers. Since we began, of our 18 volunteers that started, not one of them have withdrawn. And as the time has gone by, their dedication to this project, which started off strong, has gotten even stronger over time. They've become quite the taskmasters of me and Wayne to make sure that we stay up above. As they gain discoveries, they ask us to find more background information. And so it's a very dynamic activity. They also see the value of discovering the sources and quantities of pollution in our community that our community pours into Puget Sound. So they see that value in seeing that. Wayne, if you can go to the next slide. So here's some kind of quick points. To date, we've put in 314 hours of volunteer time actually doing the surveys. We've visited the outfalls over 406 times, and we've collected 252 complete data sets. We'll cover a data set a little later on here in this discussion. And then we've accumulated a large bag of data, 4,000 points of data that we've gathered so far. And it's telling us some very interesting bits of news. So I'm going to hand this back to Diane. She's going to do a little discussion and let you go to the next slide, Wayne.
So this program obviously dovetails in nicely with our stormwater program. As you know, we hold a municipal stormwater permit under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And this program goes a long way towards aiding us in meeting our requirements. So I listed out the 5 requirements that it contributes the most to. The first 2 I'll kind of lump in together for this presentation, which is education and outreach and public involvement and participation. And what we have here is a group of highly trained volunteers, and they're local residents. They know about stormwater, they know what to look for. And I have a lot of communication back and forth with them regarding what they see out there in the field, what their concerns are, what they're finding. And this information helps to shape the stormwater program. Then there's also a ripple effect as all of these participants are talking with their neighbors and talking with their friends about what it is they're working on and spreading a lot of information about what does and doesn't go in our storm drain and the consequences of that. So it's a really, really valuable tool for education and outreach and for bringing the public into our stormwater program. Next up is the Stormwater Management Action Planning, which requires us to do a receiving water analysis and then select a high priority drainage basin to plan targeted education and outreach, retrofits, increased maintenance to try and improve the water quality in this basin. So this is a huge project that's going to go on for many, many years. And with the data coming in from these volunteers, we'll be able to say with a really high degree of certainty that we are selecting the correct basin, which will really be the most efficient use of limited resources to be able to put towards retrofits and targeted outreach. For mapping and documentation, volunteers are out there, they've got GPS units and they're ensuring the accuracy of our map points. And finally, for illicit discharge detection and elimination, which is a really big piece of the stormwater program. Again, they're highly trained. They know what to look for and they know who to contact. So, I had one volunteer reach out to me because she was just on a walk in her neighborhood and saw something that she thought I should know about. And it's really valuable to have community members out there. To have more eyes out there gives us more opportunities to collect or to catch spills and illicit discharges before they reach the Salish Sea. Next up, Wayne will tell you a little about what parameters it is that they're looking at.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, my name is Wayne Huseby. I'm with Friends of Skagit Beach. It's been there for some time. Anyway, we collect data from both using a highly sophisticated meter, which is shown there in the lower left. It's made by a company called YSI. And that gets the water temperature, the dissolved oxygen, conductivity, and pH. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But we also correlate that data with air temperature. We look at the past 24 hours of rainfall because obviously if you're going to get stormwater, you have to have some rain. So we try to correlate that. Although we send volunteers out there and look at outfalls on a quasi-regular basis. So in many cases they get there and there hasn't been any rain, so they record that. But that is a data point. So we want to make sure we get that. And then they make general observations, which Diane was talking about. And that is if they see something that doesn't look right, those are those extra eyes that we have with the city. If we can refer that to the city, and then they can send crews and experts like Diane and her team out there to find out what's really going on. And then turbidity down here in the lower right is a Lamont meter that's on loan to us. It's in our lab at Tim's house. So it's a shared resource. So all the volunteers use it. So thanks to that's part of that partnership that Tim and Diane were talking about. I did mention that we look at air and water temperature, and what we're looking for is a difference. If we go out and measure the water temperature with that sophisticated meter by using that probe, and then we record the ambient air temperature, and if that is greater than about 3 degrees, analysis has shown by other experts that that is potentially an indication you've got something that might not be quite right. And so we record it, and then if it's more than 3 degrees, we forward it on to Diane as a possibility. And then we track it and monitor it over time to see if it's consistent or it was just an anomaly. We also measure dissolved oxygen. And I think most of you are probably aware dissolved oxygen is pretty critical. It compares the temperature of the water, another field measure we do is dissolved oxygen, as I said. DO is needed to sustain aquatic life. Low dissolved oxygen can actually be lethal to some fish. Low DO may be an indication of an oxygen consuming process further upstream, such as decaying plant material, debris, food waste, and pet waste. One of the things that I didn't realize is that salmonids, which is the picture there, I think those are probably sockeye salmon, but salmonids are extremely sensitive to low dissolved oxygen and pH. Conductivity. We take a look at conductivity in the field, also using that same meter. Conductivity is the measurement of the water's ability to conduct electricity. It generally increases when compounds like chlorides, nitrates, sulfates, and phosphates are present. Fertilizers are an example of that. Some elements like sodium, magnesium, calcium, and iron produce positive ions when immersed in water, and they also conduct. High conductivity may indicate either a runoff, like this picture is suggesting, fertilizer coming off a field, or we may have just a soil runoff that's carrying some clay, fine clay in it. We also, one of the things we fight here in Anacortes, because we're surrounded by ocean or bay, is saltwater. And those saltwater intrudes into those pipes. And so sometimes we get high conductivity, and it's really a result of saltwater intrusion. So we have to take pains to go up further upstream and go up a couple manholes to get a sample, or wait till the tide is certainly low enough we can get a sample. By the way, sewer contamination is another area that also can be high conductivity. pH. pH is something we also measure in the field on that, using that same meter. By the way, it's really a very powerful meter. They're not particularly cheap, but they can measure several things with 1 meter. That probe is multi-purpose, and pH is one of those things. It defines the relative acidic or alkaline nature of the stormwater. Pure water is neutral with a pH of 7. Rainwater is mildly acidic at about 5.6. Stormwater is more alkaline with a range of 6.5 to 7.2 due to the fact that when it runs over pavement, it picks up alkalines. Typically, it's cement, and those things tend to be alkaline. So stormwater is a little bit more alkaline than otherwise would be. The saline sea water around us here is mildly alkaline with a pH of about 7.8. As I mentioned, salmonids can begin to die below a pH of about 6, so they're particularly sensitive to acidic conditions. High or low pH may indicate industrial pollution due to acidic water, wastewater rather, solvents, cleaners, chemicals used in printing and graphics or production of cement products. And the last thing we measure out in the field is, well, actually we come back to the lab with a sample, is turbidity. And turbidity is basically just a measure of the clarity of the water. And we use a measure, we use that Lamont meter, which is owned by the city of Anacortes. They graciously loaned it to us and put it in our lab. It tends to increase with high water temperatures, and which subsequently depresses rather the dissolved oxygen. High turbidity may be an indication of soil erosion, waste discharges, or excessive algae. The threshold on that is 50 MTU, and that's what I've circled there. So anyway, those are the things we measure with the meters. So I want to pass it over to Tim. So Tim, the question is, what are the pollution levels in Anacortes? What have we learned?
Thank you, Wayne. Up to date, in our first year, we now know that 7.9% of all of the samples that we've taken, they exceed the state threshold for into the realm of polluted water. And the state has a level for the 5 things that we measure. So after a year now, we now know the Anacortes stormwater has about an 8% pollution load of all of our samples. I'm going to actually hand this over to Diane because she can help you with more breakdown of this. Diane?
Yeah, so I do want to clarify when they're talking about the levels, what it is that we have are thresholds. They're called illicit discharge thresholds that are recommended for when you want to look and see if there's something else going on. With all of these, there can be natural processes, and just because something exceeds the threshold doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but it means that you want to take a look. I think that's an important distinction to make. So here it shows which indicators we've seen exceedances of. And temperature and conductivity are the ones that have exceeded the thresholds the most. Temperature typically is most useful for detecting illicit discharges when the weather is really cold and the water is significantly warmer. As I said earlier, when we see a difference with the water being about 3 degrees warmer is when I get a notification just to keep an eye on it. Thus far, we've not seen anything where it's been, a significant difference that I found really concerning. The other big one has been conductivity. There actually is no state standard for conductivity for fresh water, mostly because it can be influenced by so many natural processes, including the local geology, groundwater characteristics, temperature. The threshold we have for that is greater than 500 microsiemens per centimeter. For reference, the drinking water standard is 700 microsiemens per centimeter. And the big thing we've run into here is marine water intrusion. With all the salt and ions in marine water, conductivity is really high. So we first hit a few of these outfalls and just thought, oh my goodness, what's going on? And then realized, oh, it's because there's salt water in there. And it's been a process. So if you go into the next slide, you can see the outfalls where we have seen the problems. The darker the color is the higher number of exceedances. And for several of those, what we have had to do is keep looking upstream to find how far we need to go to get out of the tidal influence. There are some catch basins where you pop them open and there's mussels down in the bottom because at high tide, you've got some of the salt water backing into the system. So that's what we're seeing now. And if you want more detailed stuff, Tim's going to take it away to the end here with where you can see all the live data.
Thank you, Diane. This is Tim again. What we did is we've created a public website, and it's the blue text there of stormwater-anacortes.com. And on a monthly basis, we update all of our graphs that report, basically it's a summary of all of our findings. And so if at any time you have a curiosity what the pollution level in Anacortes is, or at least what we're detecting, this website will have that information. At this time, I want to thank you for the time you've given us. And if you've got any questions for any of us, we'd be happy to answer them now if you'd like.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Mr. McDougall.
Thank you all for this, well, for your efforts. First of all, this is fantastic. And to all the volunteers, big thank you as well. And this is really informative. This was a very nice presentation. A couple quick questions. You said that you're able to access about 60% of the outfalls. The 40% that you're not able to access, are they reasonable? Like, are they roughly evenly distributed throughout the sort of upside down U of Anacortes, or is there a certain chunk of town where there's a bunch where we can't get to?
This is a good question. And this is Tim here. We have a very good distribution from Skyline Marina all the way down to March Point where we are covering it. And so the areas that we're not covering, it might be because it's either on a steep slope, so there's a safety issue of reaching it, or it might be on private property, and and the owner lives in another state, so we've not had communication. Or the third reason is it might be adjacent within 50 feet of another site we're measuring. And so there's not going to be a significant difference. So those are the three conditions for something that didn't make it on our monitoring list.
Got it. That makes sense. And secondly, I just pulled up the website, actually. The difference between the significance of the red, the yellow, the orange markers there, are those different pollutants found, or is it more like levels?
It's the number of times that that at that site we've had an exceedance month by month. So the darker the color, the more frequent month by month that site has shown that it exceeds one of those standards that Diane has set us up with.
Okay.
So black would mean it's never passed, and yellow would mean it would only have failed perhaps 1 month out of maybe 6 or 8 months.
Got it. So yellow is much more sporadic.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thanks again for the efforts as well.
Oh,
this is
thank you.
Really, really great.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough for the work. I can think back, it might have been 2014 or 2015, probably Mr. Walters and Mayor Gear remembers a council meeting where we had a report about, I think it might have been the Samish that was doing some testing on the outfalls. And number one, we were barely getting maybe 15% of the outfalls tested. And those numbers also weren't good with the, that were exceeding tolerance levels. So just the fact that you're covering so much more, giving us the information that we need to be able to figure out what we need to do as a city to help control the problem is fantastic. Because again, I think fecal coliform and probably phosphates were the big ones, and being able to figure out where that source is coming from, we can figure out where to put our efforts to try to control that. So again, I'm extremely appreciative, and I guess I do have a question. So how do we get to that point when, and this might be for Diane, when do we get to the point of, okay, the issue here is, say, fecal coliform and it's coming from here? How do we convert the info that you all are collecting to that? So that's probably for Diane.
When there's an exceedance, it gets relayed to me, and some of it will be over time if we continually see exceedances. if there's something big, I go out. Oftentimes it seems to be a one-off thing, or typically the exceedances have been low enough that there can be some natural causes. But what happens is if we see something that we think is a problem, then you start testing up the storm system. And so you go to the next junction up where several different branches come in, and you test the different branches and keep trying to track it up until you can narrow down where it's coming from. And then sometimes it's outreach to the neighborhoods or visiting businesses to see what their site practices are like. And
or maybe even see how old some of our sewer connections are in that area. And if that's something we need to tackle, that I think that will help as well.
Yes.
Diane, this is Wayne. I wanted to make one comment. Kudos to the city for the effort that you placed over the last couple of years on the GIS system and making the data of your infrastructure available, because we actually use that when she was talking about chasing upstream. Those give us the roadmaps on how to do that.
Well, again, thanks for all the great work, and we can't do it without volunteer help. So thanks again.
You're welcome.
Any other comments? So yes,
Here.
yes, go ahead, Mr. Walters.
I agree. This is really helpful, and it's most helpful because it's available on the web. I'm looking at the map right now. Can you tell me what the outfalls, the pins that are labeled as inactive, mean?
That will be an outfall that we're not monitoring. So it might be adjacent to one that we are, so it isn't going to provide us with necessarily greater fidelity of data. So that's one instance. It might also be a private property that we've not been able to reach the owner. Or it also might be an unsafe location because of a steep slope.
Okay. Yeah, that's not obvious to me on some of them, but maybe it's that redundancy issue. I see a lot of them along Fidalgo Bay that are labeled inactive.
And that's also a factor there, which is the population of the city along Fidalgo Bay, south of the marinas, or really along the Tommy Thompson Trail. They are low population areas, and seemingly about once every, between 75 and 100 yards is another outfall. And so with the low population area, there's not a lot of opportunity for a polluter or a source of pollution to become all necessarily visible or detectable, simply because the population's low.
Okay. Are we monitoring the outfall that the 32nd Street and I think it's the F basin would flow into?
Yes, I believe we are. Yes.
Okay. I think that one especially would be useful. I do recall what Mr. Miller was referring to, and it seemed to me that we were suspecting at the time that high fecal was related to the dog park up on H. And if I understand correctly, we later determined it probably was not the dog park. It was probably a sewer connection problem.
Yeah, it was also a horse. We had a neighbor with a horse.
Yep. There's a couple different issues up there.
Yeah, and that one.
Yeah.
And that one was also along 32nd Street there.
Right.
This is Tim here. You touch on something. Our original plan with our volunteer monitoring program was to include fecal coliform, and then it's now switching over to E. coli as a standard. However, we were going to use the wastewater treatment plants lab for all of our tests. Well, we didn't anticipate the introduction of COVID, as well, none of us have. And so that took away that ability for us to do that. And so we're now going to be adding E. coli to our test protocols for the second year. And we're going to be looking at the entire perimeter of all of the city of Anacortes for E. coli as well. So we'll have a year's worth of data of that set added in the second year. So we'll cover the city or the shoreline of the city all the way around. So I don't think that level has ever been done before.
That's great.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for all your work, this group and your volunteers. It's fantastic. And so it sounds like the program expires in another year. Is there a reason to keep it going, or is there a reason to stop it? Is it to do with funding, or what happens after the second year?
Carolyn, this is Tim here. At the end of the second year, that's when our funding stops. However, we will, in concert with Diane, we feel we would have basically articulated where the pollution hotspots are around the city after 2 years of looking. So I'm proposing, or we will all together consider shifting to another segment, which is if we average 8% above thresholds as our final target of pollution level, then the subsequent time period after the end of the second year could well be focused on just trying to reduce that 8% by focusing on the hot spots that are the repeated sources. So it's a shift in gear. We will have learned how much and where in the first 2 years, and then what follows from that could be an effort that's quite targeted to basically find the sources of that pollution and eliminate them, to knock that 8% number down, if that's what it's at in 2 years' time, to ideally as close to zero as we can get. So it's a phase 2 that's possible.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there any other comments? So I, for one, want to, again, thank you, but it just strikes me that the difference that getting the right stormwater manager and a group of citizens, how we can make a difference in the Salish Sea and get the pollutants out of there. So every individual makes a difference. And I'm thinking back to 2014 and just what we've accomplished in the last 7-8 years. It's pretty phenomenal. So my sincere kudos and thanks. And yeah, let's make sure we get funding for phase 2 when it's time. Okay, anything else, Diane?
I think that's it for us. Thank you for having us.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you very much.
All right, so at this time, we will move on to the next item on our agenda, and it is our critical area regulation and draft 3. And at this time, I'm going to bring Tess Cooper on to start us working through this. So it's Ordinance 3064, Critical Area Regulations Draft 3. And there she is. Welcome, Tess.
Thank you, Mayor Gear. Thank you, City Council. This evening, we are going to review the changes we discussed last week to Draft 3, and I believe you've all received Draft 3 version 2. So 3 is numbered 3.2, as well as the matrix of changes. And we're just going to go through those quickly tonight and discuss them and make sure that we're all on the same page to move forward with finalizing the draft. So with that, look here, June 14th, draft 3. We'll go over the change matrix, the draft language, and have City Council's final thoughts. So far, again, we've had a written public comment period ending in April. We've reviewed all of the public comments and went through example case studies and best available science, so we all have a good understanding. We have to discuss the final changes, review the draft and all supporting documents for necessary administrative changes in other sections of the code that support this. We'll approve the draft and adopt the ordinance. So if we look at the table. One item that was on the list, one of the versions of the draft, it appeared that seismic hazard area language had been omitted for some reason between draft 2 and draft 3, and that it needed put back in. And as I was looking through both drafts, I noticed that there was a bunch of number changes, but I wasn't able to find any. So they both drafts looked correct to me. So hopefully that's the case. We'll review it one more time together with Mr. Meismer. He was the one who noticed some discrepancies. So I didn't find any missing pieces. We'll make sure that's the case again. We had recommendation to put enforcement authority in the protection center so that it's front and center in the document. If we look here, we can see the language. So under section 1970-025, protections of critical areas. Item G, the language violations of this chapter are subject to AMC 20 civil enforcement and penalties. Where a violation occurs within a suspected protected critical area or as displayed on city mapping, the property owner must provide an appropriate critical areas report to determine impacts. The report may be subject to third-party review at the property owner's expense. So this is just a placeholder to talk about where our authority comes from for enforcement. And later on, there's some more language under the enforcement section that goes into more detail on that. And again, we should strengthen the enforcement language for potential and unknown critical areas, as well as actions that could require reporting and restoration, even if permits aren't required. So under 1971-65, we've expanded the enforcement language. Sorry for making you dizzy.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Hey, Tess, just so I don't get completely lost as you're going through the changes, the draft changes on the spreadsheet, the table, is that just changes to the second draft? That's not all of the changes listed, correct?
Correct. That's not.
Okay, just making sure, because I was looking at 70-015, and obviously that was a big change. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep, these are just the most recent changes from version 1 to version 2 of draft 3.
So the table is just changes from the last draft.
Correct.
Okay.
Came from the discussion of public comments matrix that we've went through in the last few meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, very good question. So here we go. The director may issue a stop work order to cease all work and order restoration measures at the owner's or other responsible party's expense to remediate the impacts of violations of the provisions of this chapter. The city may take formal enforcement action under AMC 2010 to ensure the violation is abated. And that the requirements of a restoration plan by a qualified professional, some of these were already there, but it's just again, putting the language that directs us back to AMC 20, where the very specific enforcement authority and procedures are, and then at the end we added the submittal review of required restoration plans for remediation violations under this chapter must be completed through a site development permit. Even if it was a violation and they were ordered to restore it, even if the action wouldn't have required a permit, they're still going to be required to go through a permit process and pay permit fees for the review of the restoration to make sure, and the report to make sure that it's going to be done correctly and that we can track the mitigation adequately. So through an application process, either an after the fact permit for regulated activities that are allowed through the permitting process, or as a restoration permit for activities not allowed under these provisions. So we've just specified the process for abating violations and the authority. It was suggested for the map section to revisit the language for adoption and updating maps, or change the language to managing the inventory of GIS. And so we had some lengthy discussion about this in the last few meetings. Staff has done some research on what other jurisdictions have for language and how they talk about maps, either adoption of maps or managing GIS databases. And so staff's suggestion, let's see, I don't have a code reference there. For the language was borrowing language, using most of our language here, but borrowing language from the new Anacortes Community Forest Lands language. Apologize. That under 1970 020 identification, classification, and rating of critical areas, critical area maps. The general location of critical areas in Anacortes are displayed on the City of Anacortes' critical areas maps. Instead of adopting a map that we're going to continually improve and add new features to, we've crossed that out here, and that the maps are used to alert the public of potential locations of critical areas in Anacortes. As new environmental information related to critical areas becomes available, every time we have a project and we get a new critical area delineation or a violation or so forth, the city is authorized to make changes as necessary to improve the inventory of the critical areas maps, and that the City Geographic Information Systems Office must maintain an interactive, publicly available online map containing the location of known and potential critical areas, and must make PDF maps available to the public upon request. So this is the discussion that you all had that you really liked, the availability of the interactive maps so that property owners can see and that we can use it live. You can zoom in, compare it to the parcel data, and that we can add to it periodically when we get more information. So this language was suggested to be added instead of just adopting a map, that it would be static and we would have to continue to talk about adoption of new maps. And that for those that still aren't technologically able to use the GIS maps, if they were to come to the office, we can print them out, the critical area maps, upon request. In reviewing the impacts of applicant's critical area report, the city may engage an independent qualified expert at the applicant's expense. Also add language to violations. So you saw the violations, we had that section in there. And we can look here, 030B3. We've added it as 5. The city may require third-party review of any critical area report at the expense of the applicant. So we've just clarified that in this section. Great. Discussion has happened about the passive outdoor recreation and recreation language. We have used San Juan County's example to really take out all of the confusing terms and really simplify this section to make it clear. 1940-040. In the exemption table. And there was some discussion this evening about how we can improve this even more. So under the heading we had is passive outdoor activities. We talked about how when it can be demonstrated and then reverting back to the provided they do not require structures, and both of these made it confusing. So simplified language that we adopt, or that we're suggesting to adopt, is outdoor activities that do not involve modifying the land or vegetation and that will not adversely affect the functions and values of critical areas.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
In the planning committee, we touched on this briefly. I think our objective here was to get rid of passive, which is retained in the label there. So we were suggesting that we delete that as well and insert the word recreation, because all the activities we're talking about are recreation. So it would read outdoor recreation activities, both in the heading there and also in the first sentence.
Okay. Okay.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. In concert with that, there is our land use intensity table also refers to passive recreation in the low land use intensity section. So I suggest that we remove the words passive recreation from that table as well, which is table 19.70.235A.
Is it outdoor recreation activities? Is that how we have it?
Yes. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ms. Moulton. So the next discussion was really talk about what does fishing access mean, but we've removed those words from this and then removed the term provided. And so we've done that. We've just simplified it. It was requested under 040 recreational maintenance and repair that we specify the section that was recently added where trail relocation is the preferred method of repair. Trail relocation further away from the critical areas is not to be considered a new trail, but is included in the exemption for operation maintenance and repair replacements. So staff added a simple So instead of preferred, we changed it to where trail relocation is the least impactful method of repair. Trail relocation further away from the critical area is not to be considered a new trail, but is included in the exemption for operation, maintenance, and repair. So as long as that is the option that is the least impactful for repairing it, then it shall be considered an exemption for operation, maintenance, and repair. Instead of preferred, so that clarifies. Okay. And this is the reverse language. So under applicability, it was suggested that instead of if it renders compliance infeasible, that in this if this chapter would result in the denial of all reasonable and economic viable uses of the property, that we just changed the language to be stronger. So that was implemented. Let me check. 045A, sorry. So here we go. Applicability for permitted alterations. An applicant may seek an alteration of a critical area and or critical area buffer through a permitted alteration when application of the standards in this chapter would result in the denial of all reasonable and economically viable use of the property, and the proposed development meets the specific terms of this section. It was suggested that under public services, that we include the terms transportation by city road for persons and freight. So there wasn't a large discussion at the time of going through these. So staff has implemented that transportation by public road for persons of freight, but I think there's some additional discussion for city council on that before we agree to that change.
Here.
Ms. Moulton or Mr. Walters?
Yes, Mr. Walter, go ahead.
We talked about this at the planning committee this evening, and we think that we haven't quite gotten this language right yet. So hold on for a second here. We, in a very early draft of the critical areas ordinance, we had an exemption, I think maybe from review entirely, for work by a public agency. This was, I think this draft may even predate Tess Cooper's participation. It was draft one. We got rid of that, as we should, because everyone should have to follow the rules, including the city itself. And what we have now is a very narrow area of exempt activities, mostly repair, operations, maintenance, things that don't change the landscape. Half of them require a letter of exemption, confirming the exemption from the planning department. And then there are two levels of review after that in the critical areas ordinance. The first is these things that we're calling permitted alterations. The second is reasonable use exceptions. So for the first level, if you qualify in the list as a permitted alteration, your project has to meet the criteria that are listed there. And then you go through a type 2 administrative review. So there's a public comment period, there's a planning department decision on your application, and there's the opportunity for appeal to the hearing examiner. The second category, if you don't qualify for the first category, your only recourse is to seek approval under this second category, called a reasonable use exception. That's a type 3 review, goes to the hearing examiner. So there's a public comment period again, there's a planning department review and recommendation, and there's a public hearing before the hearing examiner with the possibility of appeal to the city council. But there are also very strict criteria in this category. You have to meet the variance criteria. And we issue almost no variances in Anacortes, and variance criteria are mostly the same. So if we're talking about these reasonable use exceptions, they really need to be things that meet those criteria. And in the draft before us, draft 3.2, a recreational facility that included a public trail that was made of packed earth or a pervious surface and is no more than 6 feet wide is a permitted alteration under the recreational facility exception. And I think our discussion in the planning committee is that makes sense. However, something that looks like the Guimas Channel Trail as it does today, 10 feet wide, paved, would not qualify as a permitted alteration. So it would have to apply for that second category of reasonable use exception. And strict application of the variance criteria would likely mean it would fail, maybe no matter what the design is and no matter how hard it tried to avoid a wetland buffer or something like that. So we think that that's a problem. A couple of years ago, the Parks Department consultant had drawn up a proposal for a 10-foot wide paved road through the Ship Harbor wetland buffer with 10-foot retaining walls on both sides. It would have been a massive undertaking. It would have caused massive impacts on the buffer. It appeared to me it was designed without regard to our critical areas code even at the time, maybe expressly contrary to it because the consultant was apparently instructed to stay in the buffer to minimize the cost of property. I opposed that then and I oppose that now, but I don't think that any design of an extension of the Guimas Channel Trail west along Ship Harbor would meet the reasonable use exception if it had to dip into the buffer even for a second. So if there is an opportunity for a better design for an extension that follows the law, tries to stay out of the buffer, allows for hydrologic connectivity under the trail, we ought to commit to constructing it in an environmentally sensitive way, but we shouldn't preclude it through the code. So, and this doesn't just affect the Guimas Channel Trail. There may be other urban trail segments where we need to make a linear connection where it might pass through a buffer. The current draft, I think, would preclude that. And we need to resolve this in the code, not just pass the buck to fight about it later in a quasi-judicial setting where somebody applies for a reasonable use exception to make it happen. So what I suggest, and then we talked about in our committee meeting, is specific language to include a multimodal transportation corridor as a permitted alteration under public services. And that's at the bottom of page 18. Now, that does not mean that it would just get to happen. I don't think it makes sense to preclude it, but I don't also think it makes sense to have it be outright permitted without constraints. If you look at the bottom of page 18, you have to do mitigation sequencing, meaning first avoid the impact, then minimize the impact. There has to be no practical alternative. There has to be no net loss of functions or values. An equivalent or greater function and values following best available science have to be provided. So there's a lot of constraints, and it still may not work, but it provides an opportunity to design around the impact. And if we can do that, then you could pursue it. Otherwise, I think we are just setting ourselves up to fight about whether it qualifies for a reasonable use exception, which I don't think it does. And I don't think that that's what we're supposed to do. We need to provide direction to staff here in the legislative setting as to what we want to allow if it is able to meet those environmental sensitivity criteria. So Tess has got the language that I propose. That would also tighten a little bit the public services and utilities section because it would make it clear it's telecommunication and natural gas lines. So not a facility, you know, like a pump station or something like that, but the lines. And telecommunication is a little broader than telephone and cable, could also include fiber. But the most important section there is that multimodal transportation corridor, and specifically calling out whether it includes the Tommy Thompson Trail and Guimas Channel Trail or not, because although they have trail in their names, they really don't look like the traditional English definition of trail. They do look more like road. So this would make it clear that they would qualify for this provision.
Any other comments?
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with just about everything that Mr. Walters said there, because I also wrote down my main concern with this section was the 6 feet in width issue. So I think as we go through and take a look at that language, we can also take a look at that as well, just as it relates to our current trail system. I just don't want to completely hamstring us there. And there I have some comments about distances for blasting, but that's later on. Blasting distances, because I think that could also hamstring us later. But I think we need a little bit more work on this section.
Mayor Garrett?
Ms. Moulton?
I support Mr. Walters' comments, and I just want to refer us briefly to our comprehensive plan, the transportation section. There are about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 policies that we have stated as a community and entered into our comprehensive plan, our guiding document, that reflect the importance of what we're talking about here. And I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but this is what we have documentation of what we want as a community, and this ties right in with that, this language.
Mayor Gear.
Mayor Gear.
Well, let's let Christina go back to Mr. Walters. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor Gear. Yeah, I want to reiterate that we had some discussions, pretty in-depth discussions at the committee meeting, and I'm in full agreement with Mr. Walters and Ms. Moulton. This is something that our community has wanted for a long time. It's been pretty well discussed. And it's something that we need to make sure we are looking forward and supporting and making that clear that we want to see this built, because there's a lot of different factors. But I do want to reiterate the important thing is that, yes, it's a city project, but we are going to follow best available science. We are going to have to do mitigation. We're going to have to try to minimize the impact or have no impact, negative impact when it comes to those critical areas. So, we will have to follow this ordinance and hopefully build these trail systems or multimodal systems with the environment in the forefront of our mind. But we need to not be what I don't want to see is us having to debate whether or not this trail system should happen, right? Based on whatever language, because it's fairly clear that most of the community is in agreement that this would be a huge benefit to get folks out of cars, have a protected place for them to walk and ride their bikes and commute both east and west along the Guaymas Channel Trail and other areas of town if we find places where they should have that connection. So I'm glad that we're having this discussion now versus later.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
Mr. Miesmer did point out to us in our committee meeting that this would probably be considered a change that would require another round of public comment, which certainly is very important and supportable. And that could include another 14-day written comment period. Also, there could be other changes as we move our way through the rest of the document that could trigger that requirement as well.
Okay. All right. Anything else for Tess on this section? Tess, any clarification you need? No. Okay.
No, that was really good feedback. It sounds like we've had 4 council members in support of. So unless I hear any major objections, I certainly recommend that we use the language recommended and then move forward with whatever process that takes to incorporate that major. It is a fairly major change to what has been previously discussed. So that would be a public comment period. Thank you.
Okay. So why don't we move on to the next item?
Yep. We discussed that the table for the land use intensity language was kind of wonky, for a lack of a better description. And so staff has fixed that. Land use that includes the following uses or activities: commercial, industrial, institutional, retail sales, non-residential uses in zones where the primary intent is residential. Residential, just outright, not calling out the zones. High intensity recreational, such as golf courses and ball fields, and hobby farms. Fix that. Land use that includes the following uses for moderate land use intensity or moderate intensity open spaces. Parks, we've clarified that it was meant to be paved trails. I verified in the ecology guidance that that's the case. Parks, paved trails, and logging roads. And then, as Ms. Moulton pointed out today, low land use intensity, land uses that include the following uses or activities: forestry, cutting of trees only, low intensity open spaces such as outdoor recreational activities, and natural resource preservation, and unpaved trails. So that has all been fixed to work as intended. And we had recommendations to increase the buffer sizes beyond what was recommended by Department of Ecology. There wasn't a whole lot of support for that from council. So we've moved forward and we have not made those changes. We used the ecology recommendations. Likewise, we got a recommendation for limiting buffer reduction allowances and increasing buffer averaging allowances. Staff has just used, so these were all recommendations for languages that's standard in Department of Ecology guidance. And so we move forward with using the ecology recommendations. Get the the numbering of the reduction language, make sure it's clear on the requirements, and was a to be intended. Section 235D, staff has fixed that. C, D. This is the exact language from the ecology guidance, so it was meant to be. So we've left it as is, except for that, yes, it says that there was in the two below, and so we fixed it. They were lumped together. It is A, and yes, 1B was intended to be there. So we just divided those out. Um, 235H2, leave out or reference a limitation was the discussion, but as I went back and looked at it, it seemed like there was a limitation very clearly already articulated. GH2. Apologize, this one was confusing. 235H2. Actually, this one I just couldn't figure out what was meant to be there, so I think I just left it as is. So EF, G, H, and there isn't a 1 or a 2. So Measurements of buffers, all wetland buffers must be measured perpendicular to the wetland boundary. Again, so I just left it as is. Let me look. There was discussion on buffer. Let's go back to this buffer averaging allowances as to whether it should be reduced to 75% or not, or whether we should allow that flexibility for creating habitat, connectivity, and wildlife corridors. So this is the suggestion I came up with. The buffer width at its narrowest point is not reduced to less than 75% of the standard width for category 1 and category 2. But for category 3 and category 4 is no less than 75% unless for the purpose of creating connectivity and corridors, in which case no less than 50%. But of course, wetland report and an impact analysis will be stating that in order to create that this is a greater benefit and it will be less of an impact by doing so. So I've left that flexibility in there, but specified that it's only for the purposes of increasing these beneficial features. It was suggested that under streams for waters of the state, we add back in the stream names, and I've done that as requested. Apologize. Let's see. 3, 2, 5. Maybe that reference is wrong. Designation. Here we go. Waters of the state, including streams as classified in WAC 2216030, including but not limited to, and all of the stream names have been added back in. And again, reversing the language was suggested for alterations of fish and wildlife habitat conservation and their buffers, clarifying that it should be prohibited except as otherwise allowed in this chapter and may occur only if the alteration and any associated mitigation does not degrade. So 3, 2, that's. Here we go. So alteration is prohibited except as otherwise allowed in this chapter and may occur only if the proposed alteration of the habitat and any associated mitigation proposed does not degrade the functions or values of the habitat. So that language has been incorporated. It was suggested to add a clarification that under subdivisions, this paragraph does not authorize new access roads and utilities in fish wildlife habitat conservation areas and associated buffers for existing subdivisions. So 325F. 4, this paragraph does not authorize new access roads and utilities in fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas and associated buffers for existing subdivisions. And 1973 3C, make the protective language more clear. 330C. And we added a buffer enhancement plan is proposed to improve the overall functions of the buffer. So to clarify, for buffer reduction standards, if you're going to reduce it for these standards, an enhancement plan has to be proposed to improve the functions of the buffers in general. So that clarification has been added to make it more protective and improving functions. Lay down. 330F1, make language more clear that relocation in the case or protections, restoration is okay. So when I looked back at this, it really seemed very clear to me that it was already specified. So we can look at it. I didn't make any changes because I thought it was already there. But if you don't agree with me, then we certainly can look at it. Three oh F1 and F2. Additional activities allowed in streams. Type F and NP stream relocation. Relocation of F and NP streams may be permitted only when the proposed relocation is part of an approved mitigation or rehabilitation restoration plan. That was already there, and will result in equal or better habitat and water quality and will not diminish the flow capacity of the streams. The applicant must demonstrate proper mitigation sequencing. And then, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. I guess I was muted.
So here, I think maybe part of the confusion is that it allows the relocation as part of an approved mitigation plan, which might include more than just a rehabilitation restoration plan. Also, it appears that the type NS streams don't have the same requirement.
That is true, but it also says will not diminish. It must result in equal or better and must not diminish. So NS is seasonal stream. So yeah, we certainly can just lump them both together and remove mitigation.
Yeah, I think if there were just a line that said you're making it better as part of a rehabilitation restoration plan, an approved one, but not just mitigation, because mitigation could be something that a plan for something that you want to do that doesn't actually necessarily have a desirable effect separate from the other activity that you're trying to pursue. Are there any other types?
There's not. Or we could just say stream relocation.
Yeah, maybe the heading is when allowed.
Okay. Everybody okay with that? That makes sense to me. Uh, 335B, again, reverse the language about alterations and prohibited uses, wordsmith it to match the ones that we did above. 335AB. So we did the same. We added is prohibited except as otherwise allowed in this chapter and may occur only if the proposed alteration of the habitat does not degrade the functions and values of the habitat in accordance with an approved critical areas report and habitat assessment management plan. So we reversed the language and made it more constrictive, or that it makes prohibition the primary focus. And for 340, for fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas other than those designated by the city as habitats and species of local importance, that was suggested as being added into the section, but not into the heading as was suggested. So we didn't put it into the heading. So fish and wildlife habitat buffer with the averaging for all fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. We've added that approval criteria. The decision maker may allow the averaging of fish and wildlife habitat conservation area buffer widths for FWACAs other than those designated by the city as habitats and species of local importance when the critical areas reports demonstrates the following. And then the very clearly increased buffer vegetation does not reduce the functions and so forth.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. I wonder, Ms. Cooper, if in the heading, it shouldn't say buffer width averaging for all FWACAs.
That's, I believe what it says, right? For,
or just maybe just take out the word all. Is that what was meant by the comment? I'm not sure.
no, they wanted the specification that all FWACAs except species, habitats and species of local importance. And we just thought it was redundant and a little bit long to put that classification in here in the title itself.
Oh, okay.
Mayor Gear.
And that for all FWACAs can do it except for.
Mr. Walters.
Yeah, I think I would go a little further and just put a period after averaging. Because this entire part 3 is about FWACAs.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
And that's it. That's the last of all of the changes that I captured through our discussions and all of the public comments that City Council had agreed to. So if there's any others that were standing out in your mind that I missed, or any additional that you've looked at and come up with, then we can certainly have that discussion.
Well, while the council's thinking about that, I just want to clarify then, we're going to do some deep dive on 197045 and possibly bring it back. Is that true? I mean, public hearing you mentioned and.
Well, I think it sounds like we had a favorable response, so we'll just incorporate it into the draft.
Okay.
And I don't think we have to, from our discussion earlier with the planning committee, we don't have to go back to public hearing, but we could do just a quick 14-day public comment period to collect feedback. And then council, we can bring it back, finalize the draft as is, take that 14 days to create all of the other changes in the other sections that go with this and we can bring back all of the final documents and the comments on that section and have a final discussion and hopefully approve everything at that time.
Council, additional comments tonight of the things we haven't talked about? Okay. Well, and we'll let Tess get to work on what we did tonight. Now,
Sounds good.
right. Thank you so much. Thank you, members of the audience, for being here. And at this time, we will go to the next item on our agenda, which is item 5C. It's resolution 3037, waiving competitive bidding for 271 multi-port service terminals, MSTs. This is a discussion with possible action. Is this Mr. Lundberg tonight or Mr. Hoagland? Mr. Lundberg? Or is it Darcy? Who's doing this one?
I believe this is Mr. Lundberg. I believe that it's to me.
All right. Welcome, Jim.
Yes. Very well worded resolution has been placed in the packets. I believe it's page 130, right there at the very end. And Tiffany Madsen has done an excellent job of capturing the line of reasoning that the fiber division is following in requesting council to find a special market condition to exist with regard to the purchase of multi-port service terminals. Mr. McDougall introduced this a little earlier as he was discussing the Finance Committee's conversation. I can certainly answer questions. I can give a summary, whatever is council's pleasure.
Why don't you give a summary, mainly for the audience, so they understand what we're doing?
Certainly. I think the perhaps the very best way to do that would be if I could share my screen, if that's acceptable to everybody. I have a single PowerPoint slide that summarizes the status quo and what we would propose to do if council indeed finds a special market condition to exist. So with that, let me, should be another, let's see, I didn't practice doing this. I apologize that I did not, I thought I had everything open and ready to go, and I apologize. Yep, start doing this. I apologize for falling all over myself there. Am I successfully sharing my screen or PowerPoint slide there?
Yes, you are. Very good.
At the top, I've attempted to depict our status quo. In our status quo, we'll receive a small order of MSTs sometime during the middle of August. Our contractor would then start deployment. After the contractor has started deployment, a period of maybe a month or so, we would be able to begin customer installations. Once we did all the customer installations that could be accomplished with a limited number of MSTs that our contractor could deploy, we would have a period, fairly extensive, of no installations that would then be followed. Let's see if I can. That would then be followed by more customer installations. If, however, on the other hand, we would be, if the council were to find a special market condition, we would place an order for MSTs with expedited delivery that would arrive in mid-July. We would begin some prep work as soon as possible. And then once again, we would be able to start actually placing customers into service at approximately the same time as the status quo. But the significant difference would be because we would have a continuous stream of MSTs arriving, our contractor would continue deploying MSTs, and our customer installations would continue flowing. Perhaps the most significant implication of all that is that we would forego a significant amount of revenue, and that just has a snowballing effect on the financials, and that's what we're trying to avoid and requesting the special market condition finding. Perhaps I should pause at this point to respond to any questions that have arisen in people's minds so far.
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Walters.
Mr. Miller, thank you. And I support this for those who aren't on the fiber committee. I think everybody, even outside the fiber committee, knows that fiber is kind of a big deal right now, and there's a lot of competition for pieces and parts to make stuff happen. So I think this is something we need to do to get moving and stay ahead of everybody else who needs this equipment.
Okay. Mr. Walters.
I concur. I assume as well it's only going to get worse. So we should continue to be planning ahead after we make this purchase to deal with the special market condition. I think this is not generally contemplated as one of those special market conditions, but it makes sense to me.
Any other comments? All right, what is your pleasure?
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
I move approval of resolution 3037 as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Walters, a second by Mr. McDougall for approval of resolution 3037 as presented. Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
Mr. Walters?
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Yes.
Ms. Moulton?
Yes.
Mr. McDougall?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you. Is there anything else for the good of the order this evening? Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you all next week, and the meeting is adjourned.